So that's 5:31. There is a little bit of setup going, so I'll start now, and I'm sure we'll get a couple more folks. My name is Kalen. I'm a facilitator. I'll help us get up set up now for this webinar and describe its structure. And then I'll be back later for a question answer period that comes after presentations. So yes, this is a meeting about the Tahoe Keys lagoons and aquatic weeds within them. This is regarding the controlled methods test, which is a 3-year test of different controlled methods for the weeds, where the first year of this test has been completed. And so this evening, we want to talk about initial findings from year one and what happened and what it took to execute the first year of the test. And then we want to preview what's coming next in year 2 of this 3-year test. We've got some folks to help set the stage. First will be Dennis Zabaglo from Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. Pete Walcott is the chair of the Water Quality Committee for the Tahoe Keys Property Owners Association. Dr. Lars Anderson is one of the many technical experts on this project who has helped design the tests and monitor the results. And Jesse Patterson represents the League to Save Lake Tahoe, who has been engaged in this for some time. And so he can offer some history and perspective of the different efforts to address these challenges. Here are a couple of things about how the meeting will go. We already have 25 in attendance and we expect more. Throughout the course of the presentations and afterwards, please submit your comments and questions via the Q&A function in your Zoom window. And the way it will work is if you submit a written question, I'm going to see where there is overlap and commonality of those questions and feed it to our panelists for them to choose whether and how to answer. If there is a very direct answer to one of your questions, if it's a very simple, straightforward question, we might write a written response in the Q&A. Otherwise, we'll be offering verbal responses to your questions. If you have additional comments or questions after this meeting, if you need an additional discussion, if there's something else you want to bring to bear on this, please visit the TahoeKeysWeeds.org, TahoeKeysWeeds.org, where you could submit a comment or a question and somebody can get back to you. But for tonight, we'll be moderating the discussion through the Q&A and through these panelists. So with that, please let me introduce our first speaker tonight, Dennis Zabaglo.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Kalen. And thank you for joining us. I'm Dennis Zabaglo. I'm the Aquatic Invasive Species Program Manager for the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. And as Kalen said, this presentation will provide you an update on the Tahoe Keys Lagoons Aquatic Weed Control Methods Test, which you'll hear us refer to as the Control Methods Test or simply just the CMT. Sorry, too far. I'll provide some context and some background of how we got to get to the point of implementing the test. And then joining me today is Pete Walcott from the Tahoe Keys Property Owners Association, Tahoe Keys Property Owners Association's Water Quality Committee. And he'll describe some of the property owners' commitment and investment into the CMT. That will be followed by Dr. Lars Anderson. He's TKPOA's science consultant who will cover what was accomplished and learned in the first year of the test and what work is on tap for year 2 coming up later this spring. And finally, we also have Jesse Patterson, the Chief Strategy Officer from the League to Save Lake Tahoe. We'll describe why this project is important to the League and some of the complementary work also occurring in and around the Keys. So just to refresh your memories, the Tahoe Keys Lagoons Aquatic Weed Control Methods Test is a small-scale pilot project being implemented to better understand what methods and their combinations will provide the best chance for success when treating the entirety of the infestation in the future. The test is a multi-year innovative approach to treating a complex infestation using new tools, one pioneered here in Lake Tahoe, which is the use of ultraviolet C light to treat weeds, and a never been tried before approach with a one-time use of aquatic herbicides. and that would be paired with ultraviolet light and followed by all mechanical methods to control for the long term. Those two treatments are intended to provide a significant knockback of weeds in the first year that was just completed, to then allow all non-herbicidal methods to maintain that knockback in years 2 and beyond. Those treatment methods include additional UV treatments, bottom barriers, diver hand pulling and suction, and the second year the test will begin within the next month. So the invasive species we're focusing on in this test project are Eurasian water milfoil and curleaf pondweed. They're two of the most notorious aquatic plant invaders in the country. In addition, a native weed called coontail, not known to grow anywhere else in the lake, is growing in problematic levels and is a concern for Lake Tahoe. These three species became established well before our mandatory boat inspection program, and so now we're implementing control projects to address them. And why do we care about controlling these species? Lake Tahoe is one of the most beautiful water bodies in the world, and controlling aquatic invasive species helps preserve it for generations to come. They have severe impacts to Lake Tahoe's delicate environment by outcompeting native species and providing suitable habitat for other undesired species, such as invasive fish. They create environments with excessive nutrients that algae thrives on and reduces Tahoe's famed clarity. They also foul the nearshore. Most of us and other users enjoy the lake, ruining the experience. All of these impacts ultimately threaten Lake Tahoe's $5 billion recreation-based economy. So a little background on the Tahoe Keys. It consists of about 178 acres of waterways with roughly 1,500 homes and docks, all with access to the main lake. And almost all of these waterways are infested with Eurasian water milfoil, curleaf pondweed, and that coontail. It's the largest plant infestation in the region, representing about 70% of all the infestations in the lake combined. Due to its size, it's our highest priority for control, as it serves as the primary source of infestation to the rest of the lake. And compared to Emerald Bay, which is our largest project we've completed to date, that's at about 6 acres. The Keys is 30 times larger than that. These two channels here surrounded by that red triangle or rectangle is about 6 acres in size. So that's about the size of the Emerald Bay project. And more recently, are tackling another large infestation at the Taylor and Tallac Creek marsh systems. And that is about 17 acres in size, represented by that red rectangle at the bottom covering Lake Tallac. So the Keys is still 10 times larger than any project we've done to date. So due to that size and importance of controlling the infestation, a stakeholder committee was developed to ensure a transparent planning process to provide input on methodologies needing investigation for this complex infestation. A stakeholder committee is where the idea of this test was born, which was embraced by the homeowners, the agencies, TRPA and Lahontan, as it mimics the success of the overall AIS program, where we start small and build with lessons learned. The next step in the process was to complete the required environmental analysis, which also had to consider and protect Lake Tahoe's status as an outstanding national resource water, and that prohibits long-term degradation of the lake. TRPA and Lahontan worked together on the analysis, which included extensive data collection to establish baseline conditions that informed what potential impacts may result from any proposed treatments. The EIS analyzed potential impacts of the proposed test project, along with required alternatives, including a no action alternative. The analysis concluded that the proposed test can be implemented safely, and that the no action alternative was truly the biggest threat to the lake. So doing nothing is not an option. The EIS and project permits were approved in early 2022, which included redundant resource protection measures and mitigations to ensure Lake Tahoe is protected. Those include treating early when biomass is small. So when plants die, nutrients are being released back into the lake as much as they would when they're full grown. And then also treatments are more effective when they're small. And also treating early when water is filling the Tahoe Keys from the lake itself is one of the means to ensure herbicide spread did not go further than the test area itself. Also included use of double turbidity curtains to keep herbicides in those test areas. Also on-call divers to address any issues in the water if needed. The use of a tracer dye that mimics herbicide fate and transport. So it allowed the monitoring teams to uh, detect instantly if herbicide had breached any of those turbidity curtains. Redundant and contingency sampling throughout the area to ensure no herbicide spread towards the lake. Having duplicate samples so to make sure we have consistency. Daily monitoring of herbicides and nutrients. Aeration if needed to break down herbicide faster once those treatments were completed. The use of Foslock was approved, which was not used, but it is a tool that can bind excess levels of phosphorus, which feed algae growth. And then all of the monitoring was overseen by TRPA to ensure independency. So as I mentioned previously, the CMT is a multi-year test of multiple control methods. The first year started in late May of 2022 with Group A treatments to achieve an initial and manageable knockback with a goal of 75% reduction of those target weeds. The shapes highlighted in pink are the UV-only treatment sites. The green and yellow are herbicide-only sites looking at 2 different kinds of herbicides. And the crosshatched sites are combination sites where both herbicides and UV are being tested together. Year 2 will begin later this spring, utilizing Group B methods, which are all non-herbicidal treatment methods. And that is intended to maintain the knockback achieved and repeated in years 3 and beyond. Another innovative technique is also being tested, which is laminar flow aeration. It is a method that may alter the keys environment, making them less suitable for weed growth long-term, but it does not appear to have any direct impact on the weeds themselves. This area is represented by the blue shapes. All the colored dots you see throughout the project area represent all of the monitoring being conducted mainly by TRPA's contractors, such as herbicide degradation and movement, nutrient levels for nitrogen and phosphorus, which can be released when plants die off, as well as pH, dissolved oxygen, temperature, and turbidity. This monitoring also alerts when additional mitigations may be needed, and Dr. Anderson will go into a little bit more detail on the project later in the presentation. A lot of elements had to be in place for this project to get started, so I'll turn it over to Pete Wilcott from TKPOA, who will describe that effort and TKPOA's commitment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. Can you hear me okay, Kaylin? Excellent.
You bet,
Right.
Pete. Gotcha.
All right, we're just trying to get the steering wheel to work here. There we go. So I want to start with the incredibly wild ride from permit approval to the CMT start line. But first, I have to do the disclaimer. As Dennis suggested, I am the chair of the TKPOA Water Quality Committee, and I'm on the association board, but I cannot speak for the association. I'm a volunteer, and tonight I'm an amateur amongst professionals, so please grade my presentation accordingly. But getting into it, so the Keys has been at this weed battle for almost 50 years. We've got at least 2 decades of advocacy, homeowners and scientists like Dr. Anderson working to get attention on the problem and ultimately some focus on a solution. We were successful in getting to the beginning of this collaborative effort about 5 years ago, where we spent time doing environmental analysis and ultimately designing this incredibly sophisticated test. And then we find ourselves about a year ago with 12 weeks to implement the project. Absolutely crazy. So I'm gonna show you a schedule for the first half of 2022. I won't take you the whole thing, but basically between the red arrow where the TKPOA approved the budget to start and the right red arrow, which was the middle of the implementation window, we had 12 weeks. And I remember vividly last February trying to organize some funding with the board of directors, and a couple of the directors nudged me and said, hey Pete, why after 5 years of preparation are you guys not ready to roll with this thing? And there are 2 pretty simple answers to that question. For one, from the time the permit was established and signed off by the TKPOA, we had 12 weeks to the permit window, which meant we either do it in 12 or it's a year in 12. And the latter just didn't seem like the right thing to do. And the second, a little bit more nuanced, it was difficult, maybe even I'd describe awkward at times, to try and work details of this controversial project before it was approved. That's something we might, think about next time. So moving on, were things a little wobbly during this window? Oh, you betcha. We had no fewer than 5 go, no-go project reviews with the Keys board, February through May. I think we started in late February with a 50-50, about a 50-50 odds on a $1 million bet, $1 million investment in year 1 of the test. By mid-May, the good news is we'd gotten that up to 80-90%. The bad news is that the cost had doubled to close to $2 million. I think one discussion I just want to relate, I got a little nudge from TRPA director Marquetta very, very late in the game here. And, we talked about the momentum that the project team had. We talked about how scary the cost of delays might be, that we'd have sunk cost and inflation and so on and so forth. But what really resonated for me was, she felt that we were ready and that, this is the field project and we would respond and adapt as necessary. And I think with that, we made the recommendation to go. So beyond squeezing about a year's worth of work into 12 weeks, the team faced a number of significant hurdles to get from project approval to that CMT start line. And I refer to them as the 7 miracles, and I want to walk you through them. So the first was really, it was water depth in the Keys, and there was no hard and fast limit, but we clearly had to have enough water to move boats around, certainly the UVC boats, get to launch ramps, et cetera, et cetera. And we were right at the margin. And we needed to have enough water to ensure that we got, reasonable test results and that those could be replicated. I've got a graph here of the water level, and you can see on the left-hand side, we were right at our minimum lake level, minimum depth through the meat of our preparation period, actually of the lake fallen slightly. And then, as we all know, winter hit in April, and we got the extra foot or so that we needed to keep going. Miracles 2 and 3 combine to form what I'd describe as the needle that had to be threaded to get the project going. So the water temperature needed to be above 16 degrees C, and I'll let Dr. Anderson talk about the whys on that. And that had to happen before the lake stopped rising from spring snowmelt. So here you've got the temperature graph on the right. We've got the lake levels plotted on the left. And if you take the intersection of all the available data that we had in that February to May window, it gave us literally a 2-week implementation target to shoot for. So everything had to come together within this 2-week window. Miracle number 4, a number of contractors to be selected and briefed, trained. That's a lot of I's to dot and T's to cross. We ended up, I think, with an absolutely terrific team, 12 contractors, more than 100 people on the water, a fantastic result in a very short period of time. Moving on to miracle number 5. We were using, as I think Dennis described, double turbidity curtains to protect the test areas from the rest of the lake, and then a boat barrier to protect the turbidity curtains heaven forbid, should some crazy Tahoe Keys boat owner get too close to the turbidity curtains. And this physical infrastructure basically defined the restricted areas. And beyond just putting in the physical infrastructure, we need to have policies and procedures and notifications to homeowners, et cetera, to make sure all this worked. And I'm going to show you, this is a restricted boating areas map. And you can see we had area A in red and area B in yellow, and a little section of Lake Talac, which is not connected to the lake, in green. And each of these areas was protected from the main bay and the lake by a turbidity curtain. I've got a photo here of the turbidity curtain and the boat barrier installed just outside of area B. And note that it was installed literally a week before the test was to begin. So another miracle checked off. Number 6, I mean, we know how sophisticated and complex the monitoring and mitigation specs are for this test. And, I think especially with respect to monitoring, the precise specifications were in flux from the permit approval date to the start date. We had a number of logistical issues. And again, it's how many hours in a day, how many arms and legs can we get on the water? But, we had a tight window on standard water quality monitoring, 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. We had lab turnaround times that had to be factored in. We have boats that are behind the curtains and boats that are outside the curtains. So you put all this logistical stuff together, and we had to develop a spec that was viable and met the permit conditions. And again, I think it was teamwork. Dennis showed this map. One of our contractors, along with Dennis's team and the Lahontan staff, did a terrific job of, pulling together something that would actually work and meet all of our requirements. So then we get on to number 7, last but not least, proof of flow into the lagoons. And the Keys invested in a state-of-the-art Doppler flow device. I'll spare you the details. It didn't work. We put the device in the channel between the clean, clear, cold water of the lake and the warm, turbid, sediment-laden water of the lagoons. And we asked it to measure flows down in the thousandths of a foot per second. And it just couldn't do the job. Fortunately, the crack team came up with a very simple fix. We had a manual meter off the shelf, thank God, mounted on a pole, put to the bottom so that we knew exactly where it was. We measured at 3 depths from an anchored barge. And I think the real bonus here is we learned a ton more about flow doing it this way that I think is going to be useful going forward. So how did we do? Well, we navigated the 7 miracles, but I want to take a step back. It seems certainly now miraculous that we made it to the start line, but it wasn't just the meteorological good fortune that got us there. There was a tremendous amount of hard work, perseverance, teamwork, and some solid process that got all these tasks done in time to get the project started. So a hearty well done to everybody that was working on the project. Beyond the 7 miracles, we collected 75,000 data points. I'm not going to go over those now, but hopefully Dr. Anderson will give you a sense of what the data told us. And I think, as Dennis mentioned, no herbicides detected anywhere near the lake, so the mitigation measures worked. I think the Keys took our commitment to the agencies, the stakeholders, the public, and the permit very seriously. And we feel very good that we met those commitments. Now, unfortunately, year 1 was not without its challenges. And I'd throw them into 3 buckets here. The weather was absolutely horrific in the first 3 weeks after the start of the test. I think we were able to react and adapt, but it wasn't easy. Economics, I think, was a challenge for everybody involved in the project. Our 3-year cost is looking to be about 4x our funding level, and we've worked with the board to solve, at least half of that problem, 2/3 of that problem, and we're continuing down that track. And then thirdly, the turbidity curtains remained in place wildly longer than we anticipated, and as a result of that, we had some significant water quality issues in area A, that red area I showed before. For me personally, I think what was most painful, we had hoped to be able to have a closure of 3 to 5 weeks. When we implemented it, we said, no, it'll be closed through mid-July, just to put a little buffer on there. By the 3rd week of June, we knew for sure it wasn't going to happen in July. We moved the marker to August 19th. By the time we got to the 1st of August, we were talking about backup plans should it start to snow and freeze before we got the curtains out. So a very, very rough time there, and only made worse by the fact that in one area of the Keys, we had a super extensive algae bloom that just made it kind of unpleasant to be there. Fortunately, we got some weather relief right after Labor Day, and this cleared up pretty fast. So where does that leave us? Despite all the challenges, we're very relieved we got over the start line. We're incredibly pleased by the results to date, just 1 year out of 3, but very encouraging. There's some lessons learned, and I think there's some adaptations that will require work in future. There was definitely a little bit of grumbling during the summertime, but we got past that. But the association is focused on the prize, and the prize is a long-term solution to weed control that's environmentally sound, economically viable, and permittable. And I think the best indicator of that commitment to the project is the notion that right after this incredibly tough summer period, we took a funding measure to the members, and it passed by a margin of greater than 4-1. And shortly thereafter, the Keys Board of Directors funded a kickoff for a long-term water quality effort, which we think is going to be a wonderful complement to the weeds control methodology. So what I want to end with, the toughest question I get from homeowners: what guarantee is there? Well, we don't know exactly what the solution is going to look like. We know failure is not an option. I'm sure the collaborative effort that we're on is the right track, and I believe we're going to get there. And with that, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Dr. Anderson and talk about how we did this year.
Dr. Anderson, are you able to turn your camera on, and we'll hand over the controls? I'm not sure if Dr. Anderson's having a technical problem or not. We can't see you yet, Lars.
Yeah, Kaylin, I still see him in the
There we go.
panelist section. There we go.
Thank you.
Before you get going, Dr. Anderson, I'll just remind folks, if you do have questions already, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A now or during the presentations, and then I'll also offer another opportunity for that after we're done. There are 2 presentations left, Dr. Anderson and Jesse Patterson. So thank you very much. Whenever you're ready, Lars.
Okay, thanks very much. And Pete, thanks very much for the discussion. It's really a good introduction to the results of what happened last year. As Pete was saying, there's a lot of activity, a lot of complex interactions to get the project done. And what I want to talk about briefly is just to summarize the effects of these treatments on the target plants, which is really what we're trying to deal with here. A little description on the monitoring that took place for nutrients and water quality within the Keys. 2-year planning process. I'll close with that and discussion how we're going to handle the Group B methods this current year. But I want to focus mostly on what happened this year with the plant responses. So to orient you a little bit to that, I've put together a summary table, and it's a little bit busy, but let me explain it. On the left-hand column are the treatments that were used in the Keys last year. Indofol only. This is a very selective aquatic herbicide. On the left-hand side, triclopyr was another one, and then of course UV treatments down the side there. The last 2 rows show the indofol combination treatments, and I shaded those because we actually couldn't get in to do the UV treatments this last year because of the problems with the curtains that Pete had mentioned. I'll get back to that in just a minute. On the top of this table that shows our criteria or metrics, the vessel hull clearance of 3 feet that we're shooting for, the biovolume reduction of 75% in our target plants, and then on the right-hand side of that column there is the effect on the native plants that are desirable plants. So let's start with the indofol only. If you looked at that site, by the way, all the green arrows mean good things happened. We're ready to go forward for Group B. The sort of orange down arrows means we didn't quite make the mark on that, but there are some lessons learned from that as well. A couple of those green arrows were partially pointed up because we did pretty much close to the mark there and meet it, and we're ready to go ahead with those, but it wasn't totally 100%. But if you look at indofol, we were able to get vessel hull clearance across the board with our 3 sites, and all these sites, by the way, were replicated treatments. For indofol, we reduced biovolume by at least 75%. In fact, a lot of those sites were reduced by more than 90%. And that's holding this spring from the surveys that I've seen so far. We've been in really good residual control in those indofol sites. For the native plants, it really didn't have much of an effect on the desirable plant called Elodea. You can see there's a green arrow there. And a little bit inconsistency with some of the other native plants, but it's a selective herbicide. That's why we chose it. For triclopyr, the next one down, you can see we had less than desirable results with the vessel hull clearance, and that's kind of expected because this particular herbicide will only control your Eurasian water milfoil. It doesn't really have any effect on coontail or curly-leaf pondweed. But the reason we wanted to use it is because it is a systemic herbicide, which means it moves into the roots and the rhizomes and has a much better opportunity for a longer-term control than, say, indofol would have. But you can see what happened with our biovolume, the same problem. Because we only controlled Eurasian water milfoil, the other plants did quite well. And of course, the biovolume is based on the entire plant species that are there, so it didn't look so good. However, if you notice the bottom of that, where the green arrow is, we actually had 90% control of Eurasian water milfoil in those sites that were treated with triclopyr. So that's kind of what we expected, and that was an encouraging result as well. In addition to that, it really had no effect on our native plants. So the native plant community within the triclopyr sites and the controls were about the same. So that's an encouraging result also. For the UV sites, we had great control for vessel hull clearance, 100%. We had a lot of very good control with biovolume reduction up into the 70% range or so. Not always consistent, but it looks really good there too. And those are repeated treatments. So that's encouraging. And the only downside for the UV was we saw some impacts on the native plant communities with UV treatments. And that's not too surprising. The UV approach is really not a selective approach. It's more a direct approach on the plants that get exposed to that UV light. So that's kind of the nutshell. We had a lot of good results. We're moving well ahead to the Group B methods, but I wanted to show you some examples of the plants and how they looked when they get these treatments. So this group of slides on the upper left shows a triclopyr treatment. Just about 2 weeks after treatment, that arrow is pointing to what is really decomposing Eurasian water milfoil. You'll notice the other plants there are green. That's Elodea, which is our native plant, and there's some green, actually, curly pondweed. So this is an example within a couple of weeks of getting early impacts on Eurasian water milfoil with triclopyr. To contrast this, if you look at the 2 images on the upper right-hand side, those are a pair of rake samples from different control sites. And you can see the difference in the biomass and just the numbers of plants pulled up by a rake load in there. And we actually had several ways of assessing this. Part of it was the rakes you're looking at. And by the way, for the entire CMT last year, there were more than 8,000 rake pulls to assess the effect of these treatments on the plants. So you have a lot of good data on the conditions of the plants there. The lower left-hand one is another actual rake from 6 weeks post-treatment with an indisol site. And really what you're seeing is just about 95% of our native plant on that rake and a little bit of decomposing uranium water milfoil. And I wanted to show that close up on the right-hand lower side shows a close-up of the native plant. This was 6 weeks after the indisol treatment. So you can see it is a very selective approach to that control. So we selected these herbicides, first of all, because they're California EPA approved and USDA approved herbicides. They've been used for a long time in many other aquatic sites. We know that they can be used safely and effectively on control of most aquatic plants that are on their labels. We also decided we would use these at less than half the rate allowable on the labels. And the reason for that is twofold. One is we know based on our microcosm studies we've done here over the past several years that we get really good effect with that 2 part per million rate with indithol and 1 part per million with triclopyr. So we know we can use those at those rates. The other reason is because we wanted to use lower rates to start with, which would mean we'd have less compound out there in a shorter period of time, except for that triclopyr problem that Pete mentioned. I'll get to that in just a minute. So these were applied by boats in each site. On the left-hand side, you can see the liquid indithol was applied with a mix with its tracer dye that Dennis mentioned. And you can see the trailing dye behind that allowed us to find out where that herbicide might be going and how it spreads. On the right-hand side, the operator in the front of that boat is applying a granular triclopyr formulation. And I circled the little white dots in the water because that's where the pellets are hitting and they sink to the bottom and land locally on top of the plant beds. So in this case, we were treating a combination site and we're only treating the shoreline edges, not the middle of that site. But you can see how you can localize those treatments with that pelleted formulation. So this is an interesting map. I wanted to show you where the sites were. It seems a little busy, but we'll get to it. What I'd like you to know is, first of all, and Pete mentioned these 3 areas, and I'll show you where those are right now. Back up. Those are the A, B, and C areas that Pete mentioned that were isolated by the curtains. But notice on the left-hand side, area A was primarily indithol and with some of the triclopyr treatments as well. And on the right-hand side, we have the UV treatments outside the curtains and control sites. They're outside the curtains as well. And area B was our triclopyr only site. That was also behind curtains. And then Lake Talac was by itself, and it had a treatment that was separated from the rest of the lake by curtains as well. So what you're seeing here actually is what we call a heat map, and it's generated by using a hydroacoustic scan device, kind of like a fish finder that tells us where the plants are, how dense those plants are, in other words, the biovolume of the plants. And in this case, everything that's green is a very low biomass, everything yellow is a moderate, everything that's red is extremely high biomass or biovolume. And so what you can see here, this scan was done at the end of the season, basically 120 days after treatment, or almost 4 months after we started the treatments. And what's impressive is we're getting really still good control in the A sites with indithol and some triclopyr. We're getting good control with UV sites. Those are the arrows are pointing to where the UV sites were treated. And we're getting really good control at Lake Talac. You can see that area is just green still as well. But compare that with the other areas that are untreated, and there's still a lot of hot spots or red spots, even in late season in these sites. So it's pretty encouraging. And I wanted to show you a sequence of pattern of these kind of heat maps on the next slide. So starting in the upper left, that was a condition before we started the CMT, May 16th, 2022. And what you'll notice is everything is green, which means it's low biomass, and that makes sense. That's kind of like this time of year right now, very low biomass. And in June 6th, we see some plants beginning to emerge. There's some red zones, there's some yellow zones. And by 16th of August, you can see we still have good control in our treatment areas over there on the A side, but a lot of part of the keys has got its normal increase in biomass of plants, which is the yellow and green areas. And then the lower right-hand one is just the one I showed you, which is October, and we're still showing good control back then. So a pretty impressive response. This is the other way we can determine if we've been effective with our treatments. The monitoring that Pete mentioned was extensive. We looked not only at the effect on the plants, but we also looked at the effect from the treatments on nutrients. And I just wanted to summarize these briefly. Nutrients of nitrogen and phosphorus, for example, were quite a bit higher in the Keys than Lake Tahoe. That's not surprising. It's a very different aquatic system from the lake itself. But we did see some elevated nutrient levels in the indithol-only treatment sites. This is primarily due to the degradation of the plants and when they're treated with the herbicide. So you get some release of nutrients there. We did see some lower nutrients, which is a good effect from the LFA sites. This is the early stage of that project, and we're hoping we'd see that same trend in the next several years where we see nutrients lower in the LFA sites than the controls, because that would give some encouragement that we could reduce perhaps the algae growth in the system. And we also found that the UV treatments had a little bit less effect on the nutrient levels than the herbicide treatments. When we looked at water quality, this is pretty interesting too, because if you look at pH, the pH ranges within the Keys and the control sites was quite a bit higher than Lake Tahoe. Again, higher than the regulatory level of range that's really required. But what happened was with our herbicide treatments, we actually brought the pH down to the regulatory ranges in many of those sites. And it kind of makes sense. The pH goes up when aquatic plants do their photosynthesis. That's just part of the process. They actually cause the water around them the pH to go up. So when we were effective at reducing that biomass, plants also did not have that effect on the pH. So it brought the pH into the regulatory range. The third bullet down is the dissolved oxygen, and we did see depressed DO down at the bottom of the sites. But in the indethol and somewhat in the triclopyr sites, we saw some depressed DO, dissolved oxygen, in the midwater as well. That's not too surprising because, again, we're removing plants that normally produce a lot of oxygen, plus they're decomposing as well. But probably the most important change in water quality that we observed was this high turbidity, which Pete alluded to in area A. And the reason that's important is that not only because it was obnoxious in some sense, but it also had some impact on how fast triclopyr was being degraded. And I'll talk about in a minute or so. The last thing we saw, which is also important, is we had no effect from UV treatments on water temperature. There was some concern with this UV treatment, which is a high intensity UV light, that we might see an elevated water temperature, but that did not occur. So that's encouraging. It's good information to have about the UV treatments. When we monitor the herbicide levels, I think Pete already mentioned it, we had no occurrence of herbicides even near the West Channel, and therefore, of course, not into Lake Tahoe proper either. The dye really worked well to indicate where we need to sample for herbicides. The kind of key point with the herbicide sampling was to determine when we could reach that non-detect level, because that's our threshold for getting the curtains out. Indethol became non-detect about 45 days after treatment. So if we'd only had treated with indethol by itself, we probably could have pulled the curtains out 45 days or so after the treatment. However, triclopyr took more than 100 days to get down to the 1 microgram per liter threshold that we needed to get those curtains out. And again, probably the reason for this is because triclopyr is actually degraded by light. And with that high turbidity in that area A, it certainly reduced the rate of degradation of triclopyr. I'm sure that's part of the cause for this. So it's very frustrating, as Pete said, and sort of surprising to all of us, but if those things happen in the field, you learn from them. So moving on to the second year, which we're into right now in Group B, that information that we garnered from year 1 is being used to determine which areas will get the Group B treatments. Dennis mentioned this. We're going to be looking at bottom barriers, diver-assisted hand removal, and of course, UVC light treatments as well. But we're looking right now at the spring conditions out there. And the interesting thing about this year compared to last year, in addition to the fact that we know we're going to have more water, last year at this time, Pete mentioned the fact that we were looking for 15 to 16 degrees. And the reason is we wanted to have some active plant growth going on in order to get the most effect from herbicides, for example. This year, we're barely seeing 12 degrees at the bottom of the Keys. And it's all the snow melt, and there's going to be more of that. So we're going to be somewhat delayed in terms of getting plant growth to sufficiently analyze the areas for the Group B methods, I think. But regardless of all that, as we did last year, we'll be looking at the monitoring environmental factors. The only thing we don't have to monitor this year, though, is herbicides because we're not using them. So that's encouraging, too. So we have a decision scheme for where we're going to place these Group B methods. There are 3 conditions where we won't be using them. One is if no target plants come up, or if only desirable native plants come up, then we won't use the Group B methods. Or if we didn't get effectiveness in some of the sites, so those sites will be off the table for use. But those 2 middle boxes in there are the probably more likely conditions that we're seeing now. So we'll have some areas where we've got desirable plants mixed in with the non-native plants coming up. And the key with our decision scheme here is that we will use the most selective methods to remove the emerging non-native plants when in the presence of native plants. We want to be selective the way we started with. And that will depend on the size of those areas as well. If they're small enough, we can use diver-assisted dredges or hand removal. If they're large areas, we'll have to go to bottom barriers or perhaps using UV light as well. So there's a whole range of assessments and decisions making that's going to be going on in the next week or so to make those decisions on Group B sites. So we're up to this point where we've got contractors, Pete mentioned contractors and getting everybody pulled together. We're doing that right now for year 2 for the installation of bottom barriers and for the diver-assisted removal process. Getting our equipment prepped up for monitoring. Again, we're going to be doing extensive monitoring in the system. We're getting our baseline surveys to determine which sites are best for the Group B methods, and getting those contractors to work hopefully around mid-June or so. So all together, if you look at it, we've got great data from year 1. We've learned a lot of lessons. We're ready to plunge into year 2 with these Group B sites, and hopefully within first part, the second part of June, we'll be well underway with the Group B methods applications. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Jesse.
All right, thank you, Lars.
Okay.
See if I'm driving. I think I am. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening. My name is Jesse Patterson. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for the League to Save Lake Tahoe. Very quickly, my background's in aquatic biology, environmental science, natural resource management. I've done this for quite a long time. I learned very quickly in this process and this journey that I've been through that if you don't have the answer to a problem, especially an environmental problem, a scientific test, especially steeped in community engagement and tactical management approaches, can offer some valuable insights. So if you don't know what to do, test what to do with a lot of data and move it forward. I think this project has all of that. And just to cut to the chase, the League supports the control methods test for those reasons and more. A little bit of background about who we are. We've now been operating 66 years and protecting Lake Tahoe through environmental advocacy, always steeped in science. Our mission has remained unchanged. I'd like to point out that we focus on water quality and its clarity for the preservation of a pristine lake now and in the future. So we're always looking in that forward-looking scope. We built a staff of experts in science policy and community engagement. And just to point out the obvious, we take this very seriously. We believe we would never support something that we believe could cause damage to Lake Tahoe. And we're always looking for something that can solve a problem in a very safe and cautious way as we learn what to do. So I'm here today to kind of pull us out of the weeds, pun intended, and kind of look at this in a bigger picture scope. It really was a decade-long journey for the League to kind of come to the control methods test and support and be part of this solution to a problem. And I want to kind of walk you through that and some of the things we went through and some of the things we're doing now pre-test, during the test, and we plan to do post-test to make sure that this test results in the long-term outcome we're all looking for, which is protecting Lake Tahoe from the threat of aquatic invasive species and its impact on water quality and water clarity. So this really started in 2012. I do believe the League was involved before, but in 2012, we got really engaged. We learned through the Lake Tahoe Aquatic Invasive Species Program that the Tahoe Keys were indeed challenged by this issue of invasive species. It was having an effect on the lake, we believed, and if we hoped to protect the lake, we had to work on it. We implemented a couple of community engagement-based citizen science programs, Eyes on the Lake and Pipe Keepers, to get more data on what's going on and to engage the Tahoe Keys. The Tahoe Keys property owners actually welcomed us in these programs and invited us in to talk to their members and bring in community on these issues. In 2014 to 2017, a waste discharge requirement from the Lahontan Water Quality Control Board said, the way you're currently managing the weeds is not helping. We'd really like you to focus on an integrated weed management plan to develop something that could be a long-term solution. We also want you to get stakeholders involved and work on a non-point source plan to develop what might be causing some of these issues, what nutrients could be coming from. And this process was hugely valuable to the League and myself, particularly meeting many people that are actually on this call. There's too many to name, honestly. Like, this journey was supported by so many people, many of them involved in this process. And that information helped us get to where we are today. And so that was a very valuable time in learning what we might do with something so challenging and so complex. In 2015, the Tahoe Keys Aquatic Invasive Species Control Project was reviewed by an independent science panel, and that was actually made public. That whole process was made public. There was an opportunity to engage with the scientist, and they really pointed out that this was a problem, and we needed to look at something perhaps outside of the toolbox we currently had for controlling AIS at Lake Tahoe. An implementation plan at that time was proposed by the Keys, not to be permitted per se, but to put out and be reviewed. It did have a lot of herbicide use in that, and it was the same herbicides that Dr. Lars Anderson just mentioned. But it was what I'd say at the time was a very aggressive approach that was supported by science. They said this would work. This is the way we could do it. And in 2015, the league, myself, were cautionary. We weren't totally sure that doing this approach was the right thing for Tahoe, because we wanted to make sure there weren't unintended consequences of an approach like this. So transitioning into 2016, we really had an explosion of curly leaf pondweed in Lake Tahoe proper, which is a huge concern of ours. Curly leaf pondweed can establish in a lot of places in the lake. It can take over. It can do quite well. It can remain dormant until conditions are correct for it to explode. And it was just something we were seeing this was real. This was coming into the lake. So we really started exploring ourselves control methods that could work on aquatic invasive plants. And in 2017, you said it's really great to advocate for things and have an opinion, but if we really want to solve it, I think we need to show everybody we're committed financially. At that time, we were financially committed to non-chemical control methods, containment methods, water quality improvement methods, and increased monitoring. We needed to learn more. We need to contain the problem. We need to focus on water quality. And this was in 2017. So at the same time, UVC light was being tested at Lakeside Marina. And the Tahoe Resource Conservation District was leading that with others. And this was a new technology. This was emerging. This is brand new. Nobody had seen this for this application before. It was really, really cool, to use a very simple term. We were excited, but we didn't know enough. We were also implementing education and implementation projects like boat backup stations to relieve aquatic invasive species from being spread by boat out of contaminated areas. And we really focused heavily on educating boaters and others about how their boating and their recreation affects things like aquatic invasive species and spread to the lake. So really, really connecting the Keys to the lake and the entire issue. And then in 2017, and unfortunately to today, harmful algal blooms are a reality at Lake Tahoe. They were a reality in the Keys lagoons. They're a reality in Lake Tahoe. The entire Western United States is dealing with this. And we knew, or I knew from an aquatic biology background, and others knew, that there's a connection between the aquatic invasive plants and harmful algal blooms. So we needed to look at the plants if we hope to address harmful algal blooms. Here's just a photo of a harmful algal bloom mixed with the plants. Perfect synergy right there. Not what we're expecting at Lake Tahoe, not what I ever wanted for Lake Tahoe, and not what our mission entails. So something needed to be done. In 2018, thankfully, a new stakeholder committee was put together to look at options like the control methods test. That is the group that's before you today, plus many others that are on this webinar that should be highlighted. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to highlight all of them, but I will say again, without them, we wouldn't be where we are. Also at that time, some new ideas were coming up. Madonna Dunbar, who I hope is on here today, I just want to give you a little credit. She said, have you thought about bubble curtains? And I was like, what are bubble curtains? Started looking into it. This was a new technology that, for aquatic invasive plant control. It had been used for aquaculture and other things since the 70s, but we wanted to try existing technologies for this application. We also wanted to get more data. And so we funded some hydroacoustic scanning outside of the Keys in the Lake Tahoe proper to see if this truly was spreading into the lake and this really was a concern. And this is coupled with other monitoring efforts by our partners. Here's an example of that bubble curtain. I think it's fairly straightforward, but imagine a wall of bubbles, right? So a wall of bubbles, in this case, in a V shape that allows boats to pass through, actually aquatic fish to pass through, no problem. But the aquatic fragment, or the plants, or the fragments of the aquatic plants, when they float on surfaces or attached to boats, they're dislodged and or contained by this in some degree, and they're kind of shifted to the side where they could be easily collected. And the idea was really, it's gonna take some time to figure out what we need to do in the Keys, and we need some time so we make sure the lake is not continually at risk while we learn how to address this issue. And this is the first time that I've been aware of anywhere in the country or the world where this technology has been used for the containment of aquatic invasive plants. It's been used for other things, but this is a new technology. And just a side note, other people have taken note, and new industries that are working on things like desalinization and others are looking at bubble curtains as an effective tool for controlling aquatic vegetation. So what we're doing in Tahoe is being watched and is being shared, which is another benefit of the control methods test. In 2019, the league funded and implemented with the Tahoe Keys property owners a 6-acre laminar flow aeration test to look if we could improve water quality conditions and reduce the muck layer, which is a nutrient source for the plants, one of the primary sources for the plants. We could reduce that over time through a management control that would make it harder for those plants to grow in the future. It's now been operating, obviously, almost 4 years, and it is part of the control methods test. And it was really great to get that in the water even before this test was fully finalized and approved. Just show you a couple pictures. This is where it's located. This is one of the sites on the control methods test map. Just some photos. I mean, it's basically bubbles, and it's inserting oxygen into the layer between the water and the sediments that activate sort of the biology there to eat up the muck, eat up the nutrient layer that the plants rely on to grow. And we actually believe this could be a long-term tool to be implemented in complement to anything else we're doing as part of controlling aquatic weeds. In 2020, there's a infestation offshore that we found through the monitoring I mentioned earlier, called the Tahoe Keys Complex or Tahoe Keys Offshore. And we wanted to really implement laminar flow aeration in other places outside that 6 acres. We again funded some of that in partnership with public funding. And here's a picture of essentially that aquatic weed sort of marching out of the Keys into the lake, in this case in the dredge channel for boating. So it was getting into the lake, and the mapping showed that it was significant. This was a significant infestation in the lake, certainly connected to the Keys. We could no longer think of the Tahoe Keys of a problem by itself. This is a lake-wide problem. This is something we solve together. The Keys are not on this on their own. We're not in this on our own. This is something we have to do together. And this really brought that to our attention. And we are doing work actively with our partners to work on this offshore complex at the same time as the control methods test. In 2021, we decided that it would be a good idea to maybe put a bubble curtain on the east channel. There are 2 entrances into the lagoon system. One on the west side, which is the homeowner's side, which is the side where the test is occurring. And then on the east side, which happens to be where the largest marina at Lake Tahoe is housed, the Tahoe Keys Marina, as well as the Beach and Harbor Association and some of the homeowners as well. So they're both infested in the same sort of density. They're both potentially a threat to Lake Tahoe, and they both need to be considered. So we thought putting a containment curtain on that side would be a wise idea as well. We worked with our partners to constantly improve the curtain on the west channel by implementing laminar flow aeration in this photo. And we did a completely different design in the east channel with a double bubble curtain for you alliteration fans out there, at a different angle to assess what is the right design, what is the right implementation for something that could work for containment. In 2022, as you well know, the control methods test was approved and implementation began. And then to look to this year, we're actually very excited to be working with the Tahoe Keys Marina, which is under new ownership, and working on really containment technologies. What is a combination of containment technology we can do? We have other partners like EcoClean Solutions that are introducing new technologies that might help us contain issues like this, not only in the Keys, but in other infested marinas at Lake Tahoe and other infested areas in the rest of the world, that gives people the time and the comfort to analyze and assess what is the best method for controlling it, because containment is not the solution by itself. Some form of control and management is, but I think containment offers us the ability to spend the time necessary to find the solutions we need, which is really the best approach when you have such a daunting task ahead of us. And just to speak to that a tiny bit more, the Tahoe Keys Complex East Channel Containment Project, this is the East Channel. Many pictures on here, but we're using technologies like something called the Collector, which is a passive skimmer mounted to a bulkhead, and a Pixie drone, which is a drone you can drive in the water that picks up plant fragments and litter. And we're combining these with the existing bubble curtain, and hopefully with other things occurring in the area like dredging practices, which may offer an opportunity as an additional control method if studied and analyzed correctly in combination. These are things we can share with the rest of the world about how you can contain an issue while you're testing for the best combination of solutions. So this is essentially a control methods test for containment happening at the exact same time. And just an example of how the league is really looking at the whole picture with our partners on not only addressing the issue in the Keys Lagoons, but how it affects the lake adjacent. So back to kind of the main point, we support this control methods test, obviously in all caps here. This is something we're very, very serious about. And really the status quo is destroying the lake. The way we're managing weeds now, as far as the Keys are concerned or other ones, is not helping the situation and is spreading to the lake. The methods we have in our toolbox currently that are permitted and allowable are not effective enough to address something like the Keys. And there's really no silver bullet. Not one of those methods could do it on their own. So what combination of methods give us the best chance at getting a handle on this? The conditions in the Keys and the lake are getting worse. The no action alternative that Dennis mentioned earlier, that full analysis, which is also something very unique to this project and Lake Tahoe, is it showed it was really the only alternative that had significant and unmitigated impacts to the lake. These are the only thing that would make the lake worse in certainty was doing nothing or maintaining the status quo. The control methods test posed no significant threat to the lake in any alternative, including the one being implemented, and it's a science-based 3-year test to learn. Adaptive management is essential. This should have been in all caps too. Between years 1 and year 2, where we're at now, involves adaptive management. Between years 2 and 3 involve adaptive management. And if somebody asks me, how do you know if the test is working? I would say I can only answer that at the end of year 3, because the goal is to be able to maintain this knockback in extended time without the use of herbicides, which is what we're looking at. And that 1-year use of herbicide combined with non-chemical methods and maintenance is completely new and unique to Lake Tahoe. This has never been done. I think that there's actually something we could learn here at Lake Tahoe that could be shared with other parts of the world on how you can control aquatic invasive weeds by using all of the tools. So the league will continue to focus on this as well as complementary projects, but I have to say the control methods test is essential to the long-term solution. Without the test, the rest of the stuff is valuable, but really I don't see it combining into a solution unless we learn more about what to do in these situations. And the league will remain committed. And I do need to point out, it's very impressive to see the Tahoe Keys property owners and the agencies and honestly, so many partners also remain committed to this challenge. It's the only way we're going to get to the finish line. And this is a long-term effort. So at that, I'll stop. And I just want to say we have a choice here. We can have the lake on the left or the lake on the right, not geographically accurate. Nevada's not doing that much better in California, but I want to point out we have a choice, and addressing the Tahoe Keys is part of that choice. And so I encourage everybody to support the effort and continue on. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of the presenters. Thank you to all of the participants for hanging with us. I know that was a lot of information. This team wanted to provide as much information as possible about what happened in year 1 and what we know now, and where we're headed in year 2. Thank you for submitting questions. Here are some. The first is a procedural question, and the way I'll do this is I'll just pose questions, and then anybody on the panel that wants to add something, we can do that. First question is about the annual report and what, if anything, will be peer reviewed or have independent scientific analysis. And if something is going to be peer reviewed, will that be, or independently reviewed, will that be made available? Dennis, do you care to chime in on that?
Sure, I can do that. We did have like a summary slide, but I know time is of the essence, so we can get right to the questions if that's the desire of the participants here. But
sorry about that. I didn't mean to cut you off. If you want to highlight conclusions, then please go right ahead. I did not mean to.
I'll go ahead and answer the question first, and then
Okay.
maybe we can go back to that. But yeah, the Tahoe Science Advisory Council has been engaged during the whole process. They participated in review of the environmental analysis. They also reviewed a portion of the mitigation program, and we're engaging with them now to look at the results that came out of the first year's test and to give an assessment on year 2 plans.
Thank you for that. Anything you want to highlight on this slide before I take the next question?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody. There's a lot of great information that was provided today, and that just wanted to kind of provide an overall summary of everything we heard, that there's an urgent need to control weeds in the Keys. It's the largest source threatening the rest of the lake. Took a lot of collaboration and coordination with agencies, the homeowners, and the public at epic levels to get us to this point. Lots of valuable information is being gained and the protections put in place worked. Results from the first year are encouraging. Several sites met those kind of project goals, if you will. Additional work is being done in and around the Keys to complement my spread. And just recently, which was not part of the presentation today, though, a planning process with dedicated grant funding has begun to address upland concerns through a green infrastructure project, assessing stormwater at a watershed scale within the Keys. And this complements some of the water saving efforts TKPOA has already enacted. We can provide some more information on that project if there's interest. Year two, this is a year two of a multi-year test, maintaining the knockback with all mechanical methods will begin within the next month or so. And at the conclusion of the test, results will be assessed to develop a long-term strategy or treatment plan to solve this complicated problem. Nothing has been predetermined. The test will inform what the long-term solution should be. And regardless of the methods used or proposed, another rigorous analysis will be completed. Tahoe Keys infestation is complicated, as I think everyone can agree, but a lot of good work has been done in a collaborative and coordinated fashion. And there's been challenges, but we're gaining vast amounts of valuable information, and solving this problem is not only extremely important for the AIS program, but it's critical for the long-term health of the lake. And if you just click one more slide, it'll just show you where information, more detailed information, can be found at the TahoeKeysWeeds.org, and also the Keys property owners website with the detailed reports that have been submitted to the agencies, most recently in March, that was required as a result of the permits.
Thank you for that, Dennis. There was a follow-up question, so I'll close this out on this piece. It was suggested that for peer review analysis to be truly independent should be reviewed by scientists not involved in Tahoe research, and that was the protocol followed earlier when the Tahoe Science Advisory Council was recruited to find an independent scientist review, and indeed the same process will be used to do that going forward. Here is a new question that just popped up. Considering the importance of the CMT, the budget appears to be very small. Why wasn't much larger year two funding made available? So that's a question about funding and funding overall for the test. Not sure that there's an easy answer to that. Do any of the panelists care to weigh in on that question?
Let me jump in, because I'm not sure I know to whom the question is addressed. I think for the Keys, we kicked off this effort back in 2017 with a long-range forecast and a special assessment of the homeowners. And it was a finger to the wind, and we had no idea, what the CMT would ultimately look like. And, it really wasn't until we had a permit and a spec that we could, build a proper budget, and then, figure out what we needed to raise. We are a homeowners association, and we need to get homeowner approval for every significant change in the budget. And so far, the homeowners have been great at supporting this effort, recognizing the importance of not just our waterways, but protecting the lake.
Thank you for that, Pete. If anybody wants in, don't be shy. I'm going to keep going to some of the questions that we've got on the board. The next one is about the design of the test and ongoing harvesting to try to manage the weed problems while implementing the test. And what does that mean for the design of control sites? I'll go ahead and read the question verbatim. Was the fact that the control sites were not true controls because they were harvested while treatment sites were not harvested taken into account? So there is an opinion there, a characterization of not true controls. But Lars, Dr. Anderson, I'm wondering if you're willing to speak to controls and test design.
Sure. Thanks very much. Yeah, it's a really good point too. I think one of the overall objectives of the CMT and the approach to looking at better methods for the keys was to compare the existing methods, which is harvesting primarily in the keys. So although you might say on the the best of the perfect world, you would have control sites that you don't touch at all. And we had a lot of discussion about this in the design of the CMT. And the problem is that you could do that. Eventually, that may become a hazard if you don't control the plants at all. But really more importantly, the CMT was designed to find out information if there are other methods or combination of methods that can do a better job of controlling the weeds than the harvesting. So we were actually comparing those methods with control sites that are harvested. So it kind of makes sense. So it's not the kind of control you always think of in a way that would be totally untreated by any means. But we're really looking at a way to improve the current methods for controlling the plants. And Jesse mentioned the problem of fragments and containment. And that's a real issue. And it gets to the point of comparing this harvesting approach to the other methods that we're trying to use, combinations of methods. And if it turns out that we can show that the combination of methods does a better job, not only of controlling the plants, but also of reducing fragment production, then it's a really good comparison to harvesting. Because we have data on what harvesting does to fragments. We did a study in 2014, I think it was, and the harvesting operation produces thousands of fragments. And so to me, it's a control that was adjusted to the purpose of the CMT.
If I could add to that, I'm a little out of my lane. I'm more focused on the operations side than the scientific side. But to the second part of the question, we do have a procedure where when the control sites are harvested, there's a calculation of the biomass that's been removed. And so we are trying to account for that, at least in some regard.
Thank you for that. This question came in, and then just as it came in, Jesse continued to offer a little bit more information. The question is the bubble curtain having positive results? Jesse is welcome to speak for himself, but I heard them say that it is a positive step for fragment control, and they're still improving and expanding the use of these, and that it's not a tool that solves everything alone, but that its intended purpose is working out. Jesse, would you offer any more clarifications to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I really appreciate the question. And we have a similar question, to be totally honest. We implemented it, and when it's been implemented, prior to that bubble curtain, fragment control was done essentially, by people on boats with pool skimmers, skimming up the fragments where they could. And that's sort of like, chasing your tail a little bit because they're all over the place. When we implemented the bubble curtain, even in its first iteration, which I have to admit had never been done, no one had ever implemented a bubble curtain at anything but sea level, and anywhere that had the sediment or the issues we had. So take it to elevation, you have pressure issues, you have a bunch of new things to figure out. So we implemented it and started taking sort of more data, more observation data. So taking photos. It, at the very least in the first few years, made collection and skimming of fragments much simpler because they were congregated behind the curtain or in corners or edges of the bulkhead. So it made the existing practice of fragment control much more effective and efficient. Also throughout that, we realized, we need to understand really efficacy, so effectiveness of this method. So how much is it containing behind the curtain? How much is getting through? And when we realized that was very difficult to do when the infestation itself was on both sides of the curtain. So I showed a picture earlier where it was growing from the lagoons out into the lake, and the curtain's in the middle. So it's really hard to tell which fragments are being generated inside the curtain in the lagoons and which are being generated in the channel just outside. And so you couldn't get an exact number on efficacy, but what you could do is calculate the amount that was being blocked behind and removed effectively by the current method. So we have a bunch of data on the volume of plants, the number of fragments that were contained and removed, but it doesn't give us that efficacy of the percentage. So this year 2 of the CMT, we're actually pretty excited to implement a much more robust monitoring of efficacy to look at that exact issue or that exact challenge is how much is getting through or not getting through. And so we'll have better answers at the end of this year on as far as like what is the number related to the efficacy. But everything else, including the visual data and everything outside of the quantitative, so more of the qualitative assessment, it's been very helpful in management of fragments. It's been very effective at kind of keeping the fragments we know are inside, but we were not entirely sure what's coming through. Hence the 2 different designs in 2 locations, and the emphasis on adding other technologies, like I mentioned earlier, to test this, because that's essentially what we're trying to get at. A very long-winded way to say yes to positive results. I like to have more quantitative analysis personally as a scientist. And so we're looking at that this year, and we'll have a better answer for you later. But other industries have been paying attention to what we're doing in Tahoe. I mentioned desalinization, I believe, earlier. They're having issues with aquatic vegetation clogging their intakes. They've come to Lake Tahoe and us at the control methods test to ask what we've done, if they could apply that technology. So we're very, very interested in finding out more specific answers to that question. So appreciate the question.
Here are 2 procedural questions, and excuse me, about the design of the test. And I'll post them both at once to see how the panelists would like to address it. The first is about the use of FOSLOC and group A methods where algal blooms might have formed, and what that means for BMAA, which is an amino acid and a byproduct of bacteria production. And so I think that could be answered in a couple of ways, talking about Dr. Anderson, if you want to talk about the use of FOSLOC and how and whether it was included. And then it might be worth mentioning the Lahontan Water Board fact sheet on BMAA. And so the second design question on the test is a suggestion, and I'll pose it, and that's that non-chemical methods testing this summer, the second year, should be in the largest scale possible if you truly want to see them succeed. Why not put out full effort and combine UV light with laminar flow aeration, which is obviously a very strong combination, says the person asking the question. Dr. Anderson, would you like in on this?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in on the FOSLOC. We had a lot of discussion about the use of FOSLOC and discussing it with the manufacturer and when it was most appropriate to use. The problem we ran into was the combination of the timing of determining that we had cyanotoxins, that we actually had confirmation of cyanobacteria, and being able to apply FOSLOC and have a direct impact on the levels there. And it looked like we were just, there's always a little bit too late to use it. In other words, once those criteria had been established with the presence of the cyanobacteria, the toxin, and the water conditions, it was like, if you put it in there now, it's too late, it's not going to do much. And so then you have another question, which is monitoring FOSLOC. And it was sort of a trade-off for what's the most benefit, and we couldn't guarantee that it would help that much. And it could actually be another effort of monitoring that would have to be done as well. But it's a good question. And I think the other problem that this whole long-term curtain installation created was we had these areas behind the curtains that normally would have exchange and have water coming in and out. That didn't happen. We basically had to turn into those areas into fairly quiescent or almost stagnant areas, which didn't help. And I think Pete alluded to that as well. So I think that was part of the problem too. But it is something to be concerned about. But I think, as Jesse says, it isn't just the keys. HABs are popping up all over the state, all over the country, actually. And it's one of these issues that we're going to deal with in terms of combinations of nutrients, but also global change and warming of these water bodies. But it's a really good point, and we had a lot of discussion about it, and that was sort of the decision we came to. And so I think the question is going to be: are there better ways down the road to get more rapid detection? Are there other ways to mitigate that? We had aeration systems going in those sites. I'm sure that helped to some extent, but it's a difficult problem. I can address I'm happy to do this, and perhaps Pete wants to chime in too. We have lots of discussion on the LFA sites and combining with group B methods. It was not in the original CMT project to do that, but we certainly are, as Jesse said, and we've all said, we're adapting to a lot of things. We are considering putting in group B methods in LFA sites, whether it's UV light or whether it's in bottom barriers or diver removal. because it was not in the CMT to begin with, it's an adaptation to change that we're seeing, but also it requires resources. So there has to be some consideration of that as well. But it's being discussed. It's on the table.
Yeah, I would just add that I think, beyond permission and resources, this panel is keen to try all three in the LFA areas if we can.
Here's a question about year one and what happened during the implementation of year one. How many exceedances or excursion from permit requirements occurred, and how many were reported?
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. Every exceedance was reported in our Lahontan report as required. And the review of those, it's ongoing with the water board right now. Most of those exceedances had to do with the water quality that I mentioned already, where we had higher pH levels, we had higher nutrient levels. Some of them had to do with herbicide residues above what's a certain level called a water quality standard, receiving water standard. These were transient and brief. They were all reported. They were all diligently reported to the Lahontan, and it's in our report as well. So we did that, and those things happened. Most of these were very transient, a matter of a few days or a week or something. Nothing had any impact on the environment. Nothing got out to the West Lagoon areas that we were concerned about, toward the West Channel in terms of herbicides. So those were all reported. And it's an extensive report, 162 pages with a bunch of appendices that adds another probably 75 to 85 pages or so. And it's all in there. So everything as required by the permit, both TRPA's permit and Lahontan's permit, was provided.
Thank you very much. Here is another question about year two design. Some of the year one treatments could not be implemented. How will this affect the plausibility of the final comparison of treatments?
Are you referring to the combination treatments in year one? I
Don't
assume
have
that's
any
right.
additional clarity on the question, but I assume that's what it's about. In fact, why don't
Yeah.
you start there and describe
Sure.
if there were any year one treatments and what the limitations were?
Yeah, so the limitation we had, as I think I mentioned in my discussion, was because the curtain stayed up longer than we expected, the equipment that does the UV application could not get into those sites. There's certain size limitations and logistics to getting in there, so they didn't get treated until late September, early October in a couple sites is all. So essentially, we had no combination UV treatment in those combination sites in year one. So we're basically starting over again in year two with the combination treatment UV component of that starting this month or in June anyway. So that's going to be the high priority, is the combination sites. But that's what happened. That's, we have to adapt to that. I think, we had a lot of discussion at the beginning of the CMT logistics, and should we do the UV first? Should we do the herbicide first? You can go back and forth, and hindsight's always 20/20. I think it certainly does tell you that if constraints having to do with these mitigation curtains come up, we need to figure out how to deal with that.
And maybe with a quick follow on that, this test is not only about efficacy, but deployment of some what are new techniques. So mentioned here, the UV light boat can become a barge to increase scale, is a suggestion of sorts that's submitted here. Anything else to say about the deployment of UV, what we've learned in year one and the logistics of that? Would you like to add any more details on that, anyone?
Yeah, I can
sure.
answer
Go ahead, Dennis, go ahead.
partially. Yeah, with UV, it's an emerging technology, and so we're learning about its use every time it's being deployed, every treatment activity, ultimately building to a larger scale. That's certainly something we're interested in. It just takes time to do so.
Yeah, and I have to say, I would compliment John Lucio and his company, because they're working really hard to adapt to new information and how the UV system works, optimizing it. I mean, it is a new technology. It's a new technology, and basically you have to learn by what you do, and that's what's going on out there.
And we saw incredible improvements from the 2021 trials to 2022. So that was great.
Couple more. One, please correct me if I'm wrong. The question is about whether the appendices, the data have been available to the public. The report is fully public. And my understanding is that the appendices are such big files that it's not easy to post. But is it true that if someone has an interest in digging deeper into this, that they can make it a request through the website to how to handle this question about the availability of appendices?
Yeah, they are available to the public upon request. There's ADA requirements and size issues as well. But anybody that wants it can reach out to either TRPA or Lahontan, and we can find a way to get them copies of that.
Please
Yeah,
use the
while we're-
emails on the screen or go through the website. Sorry, Lars, please go ahead.
I was going to say one of the appendixes that is available is our favorite one, which is E, which is the efficacy report, and that should be available. I think, isn't that on the website, Dennis?
That is on the website, yes.
Yeah,
On
so-
the
and
TahoeKeysWeeds.org website.
Yeah, so I would suggest very strongly that if you're interested in much more detail than we had time to provide today on the impact of the treatments on the target weed and so on, if you delve into that, you're going to get a lot more information, more detailed analysis of that as well. And really today we just gave you the sort of the overview of what we found, but that's a lot of detail on the impact of the treatments on the target aquatic plants.
Finally, it's a question about test design again, and whether, and if not, why not, LFA and UV light were evaluated as a combination. This doesn't make a distinction, and this might not be clear to everybody, but the difference between Group A and Group B methods. But does anybody want to speak to test design and whether, and if not, why not, LFA and UV have been designed as combination treatment methods?
Dennis, or I'll jump in. That's fine. Yeah, so the LFA was designed, additionally designed to look primarily at the effect of that treatment on nutrient availability. And in other words, if you reduce the nutrient availability, you actually reduce the likelihood of getting algal blooms, for example. There wasn't a whole lot of evidence that it actually controls macrophytes. We don't see that. We didn't see that this year. And so the idea of the combination wasn't primarily focusing on nutrients, and that's why we're looking strictly at LFA. Having what we've seen this last year in the LFA sites, it's a good idea to look at these other combination treatments, and I think that's why we're having some discussion about that now. But it wasn't in the initial CMT design.
And if I may, I just wanted to add that the beauty of adaptive management in a 3-year test is you can realize these things as you try them out. I mean, Lars's description's spot on. When we're designing the test, we had the information we had. It didn't seem like it was a combination that would provide the result we were looking for in that design. After year 1 and looking at year 2 and beyond, I think it has a whole lot of validity, and we're very much looking at it. The league's certainly interested. And that's the whole point of this test is to learn and try as many combinations as possible. And I'll point out the test is not only to test effectiveness at controlling the weeds, but literally how to apply these methods in a place like the Keys efficiently, effectively, and in a meaningful way. So we're not just testing the outcome of the efficacy, but literally how to do it. And that, Pete talked a ton about this. I think we could all say that designing it in 12 weeks is not the way to do it moving forward, right? So in year 2, we're spending more time. In year 3, we're spending more time, and moving forward in a long-term management plan as that comes forward, we'll bake all this in. We're learning a ton about how to do this, not just what the effects are. So I just wanted to point that out, and that question's spot on. We have the same question, and that's why we're considering it for year 2.
The last is a comment of sorts that says, have not seen any discussion of the continued need to reduce nutrients, which the WDR requested in 2014. Still true that there's a continued need to reduce nutrients, and how does that relate to the test?
Maybe Pete, can you address the sort of the homeowner restrictions on fertilizers as part of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's ongoing, and I'd describe there's all sorts of things happening behind the scenes. Lars referred to, phosphorus ban for fertilizers. We're looking at other non-point source issues, looking at storm drain problems. As I think you move away from the lagoons into the landscaping area, we have an objective to reduce our turf by 75% over a period of time. That's going to help us with nutrients. I mean, there's all kinds of things. This isn't my area of expertise, but it wasn't a focal point of tonight's discussion, but it's definitely something that the association's water quality team is working on.
Perfect. Thank you. And that actually brings us to time for our session tonight. If your needs were not met, or if you have additional comments or questions, suggestions, you're welcome again to submit them through any of these methods here on the screen. TahoeKeysWeeds.org has lots of information. And then these are the individual emails for, you can go asking additional questions there too. I want to thank the panelists for their time and their availability, but I really want to thank the participants for coming tonight and sticking with us through this session. We know this is a topic of great importance to many. We're glad you're in touch, and please keep in touch through the website and through the process. We will keep designing and advertising engagement at milestones where there is information to share. More to come. Again, this is a 3-year test. So thank you very much for your attendance and your participation and your contributions tonight. We very much appreciate it. Any panelists care to add anything before we adjourn?
I think good questions, and again, thanks for all the participants for attending. It's been helpful to us too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, and good questions. And I think we all went on just a bit over our time budget, but it's just illustrative of the enthusiasm, I think, for the project, for the mission.
And just thanks to the participants that remain interested in this important project. We appreciate the input tonight.
Yeah, just to add something, thank you, everybody. This is how problems are solved at Lake Tahoe. It is literally the engagement of the community and those concerned. And, every comment and question I certainly take wholeheartedly and consider. So the bubble curd being an example, somebody brought it up, we looked into it and we did it. I mean, that's what you got to do to solve a problem like this. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your interest, and please don't stop providing input and questions.
Thanks, everyone. Have a nice evening. Be well.
Okay.
Bye.